All right, let's go ahead and get started this morning. We're almost starting right on time, which is relatively novel for me the last several times I've taught. So we have been looking at the 9th commandment, that you shall not bear false witness. And we've kind of been unpacking that within the context of the legal system at the time and what that implies for our legal system. And we're also going to unpack it some more with respect to what it means for us when it comes to the importance of speaking the truth and of being honest. We'll get to some of that, I think, maybe today, but more likely next week. But as far as unpacking some of the stuff with regard to the legal system, one of the things that's really interesting when you go through the books of the law as a lawyer is how much you see in there that you can see is designed for the purpose of organizing and running a society in much the way that a lot of our laws are designed to organize and run our society. And that doesn't mean that we always like the laws that we have, especially not in the moment, but there's usually, historically at least, usually been a reason for those laws in the larger context. For example, speed limits. Now, some of you love the speed limits because you're more than, there are some people here in town who love them so much that they drive 10 miles an hour underneath them all the time. So that's always interesting when you're just driving along beside somebody who's going 15 miles an hour and you'd actually like to get to church on time. But most of us at some point or another have been driving along and either thought to ourselves or acted out the fact that we didn't want to follow the speed limit because it's an inconvenience a lot of times. And we're perfectly capable of controlling our cars at 5 to 10 miles an hour faster than the speed limit, maybe even more than that depending on the situation. And so we oftentimes get frustrated with something like the speed limit or some of the other traffic provisions. But why do those provisions exist?
Public safety.
Public safety, yeah. And generally speaking, there are some assumptions coupled with evidences that lead to why speed limits are set certain ways in certain places. Residential areas tend to be 25 miles an hour because of the risk of somebody entering the street unexpectedly, because they're narrower, because the sight lines aren't as good. Thoroughfares tend to be much higher than that, and interstates are even higher still, because on an interstate, you can sometimes, depending on the interstate, you can literally see for a mile, and so there are different expectations, and there are different needs. But the speed limit exists for a purpose, and it's not simply because somebody wanted to be mean and keep you from getting where you were going on time. It was your job to figure out what time you wanted to get there and plan around the speed limit anyway. And when we go through and we look at a lot of the different rules and laws that we have in our society, there's a purpose for them. Having dogs on a leash. Your dog might be the nicest dog in the world, and it might never hurt anybody. And I might be totally fine with your dog being off the leash because it is the nicest dog in the world and it's never hurt anybody. On the other hand, your dog might be a hyperactive mess that weighs almost as much as I do, and it might be able to knock me down. And I wouldn't want that dog off the leash, and more so a dog that's actually vicious or something like that. And so there's logic behind most of the laws that we encounter. And if you think about them, most of the time when we read a law like that, we eventually can figure out why it makes sense, what the purpose of it is. Now, Sue works with one of our school resource officer, and he teaches an enrichment class. It's a half-hour-long class in the middle of the day designed to be kind of a fun class. And one of the things that she does in that class, for part of the class over the course of each quarter, is goes through it and has the students look up silly laws that don't make any sense. And there definitely are some laws that don't make a lot of sense. Most of them don't make sense because they were written a long time ago, and in our modern society they seem kind of silly. But some of them, it never really made sense. But when you go through and you look at the law of Moses, there are some laws that relate to, a lot of laws that relate to how you worship and what sins are, what a sin is and how you deal with the sin and things like that. Sacrifice, cleanliness, but there's a surprising number of them that talk about how you determine what's true and what's false. What you do if somebody had something stolen from them or had something taken from them. How you assign responsibility for debts and for losses and for things like that. These are relatively sophisticated ideas. It's important to understand that our society has been developing a higher and higher level of sophistication as we've had more and more free time, as we've had more and more assets, as we've had different kinds of assets. And so you develop sophistication over time, but it's impressive to realize when you look at the law of Moses that this is a law that's being created by a bunch of people who are basically what we would look at and say, that is an ignorant savage right there. And yet these ignorant savages came up with a fairly impressive law in terms of how well it's thought out and how well it works for its purposes. And it's hard to explain that other than by recognizing that God was involved in that process. Now, the additional argument, and I would say that probably the one guy who really kind of maybe understood where God was coming from was Moses, the guy he was giving it to. Because of all of the Israelites, what advantage did Moses have in terms of understanding civilization?
Talk to God.
Okay, well there's that, but let's go back a little bit before we start talking to God. What advantage did he have?
He knew Egyptian law.
Okay, he grew up in Egypt not as a slave, but as basically part of the ruling family. He saw the purpose of laws. He saw this, understood the logic behind them in many cases. And while the Egyptians were barbaric in certain ways, they were at the time one of the most advanced societies in the world with one of the most advanced legal systems. So it's not surprising that when God tells these things to Moses, Moses is probably thinking, that makes sense. And when he tells them to the Israelites, I suspect, are probably thinking, why do we have to wash all of our stuff? That seems sort of pointless, Why can't we eat pork? I don't know, anyway. But so Moses probably understood better than most why these laws came into effect. But for most of the Israelites, a lot of these things would have been concepts that were kind of beyond them. And so, not in the sense that they couldn't understand them, they couldn't necessarily understand the why of them, at least initially. And so we see in the law of Moses a number of places where it hits on things that are actually really important questions and issues for us today when we think about our court system. And this one in Deuteronomy chapter 17 is one of those. Here, the Lord says, if there is found in your midst in any of your towns which the Lord your God is giving you, a man or a woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God by transgressing his covenant, and has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, or the sun and the moon, or any of the heavenly host, which I have not commanded, and if it is told to you and you have heard of it, then you shall inquire thoroughly. Isn't that interesting? What it doesn't say is then you should go burn them to death, or then you should go hang them, then you should go form a lynch mob and take care of them. It says you shall inquire thoroughly, which is actually a very different approach than, for example, the Salem witch trials did. They didn't inquire thoroughly, they inquired sort of mildly by torture, and then they went and did whatever they wanted to. But it calls for a thorough inquiry. And we see this idea over and over again showing up, this idea of inquiring thoroughly before a decision is made. We see it in Deuteronomy chapter 19 where it says the judges, who've been called to judge a particular case, shall investigate thoroughly. And then, so there's this calling to go find out what really happened. And we've looked already at the idea that you need more than 2 or more witnesses to condemn someone to death for a death punishable offense. But even beyond that, there's this idea that when they're investigating, it is the duty of the citizens, it is the duty of the rest of the Israelites who know something about it to provide evidence about it. Whether it's for the person or against the person, if you know something, you have an obligation to speak out. Why do I say that? Because in Leviticus chapter 5 it says, if a person sins after he hears a public adjuration to testify when he is a witness, whether he is seen or otherwise known, if he does not tell it, then he will bear his guilt. So this is really interesting, because what it's saying basically is if you know something, you have to say something. I think there's actually some kind of TSA thing about that. But now imagine if you were a police officer, had been a police officer, for example, if in fact every time that something bad happened, everyone who knew something about it came and told you. That would probably make your job a lot easier. I mean, not the person who committed the crime, probably, they're not going to do it. But everybody else, one of the most common problems that police have in investigating crimes is it's hard to find witnesses a lot of times. Because the witnesses most likely know the person who committed the crime, or live in the neighborhood where that person's family does, or live in the neighborhood where that person's associates run, or in some other way have a reason to be afraid or ashamed or whatever it is, and it keeps them from testifying. And so it can be very difficult to find witnesses when you have a criminal case or any kind of a case going on. But here the law actually says it is your job, if you know something about something that's happened, to step up and tell it, and to tell it truthfully. And if you don't, it's actually a sin. Just like, remember, it's kind kind of like, in a way, sort of like the perjury thing, where, you know, if you try to get somebody into trouble by lying about them, then they're going to do to you whatever would have happened to them if they'd been found guilty of that. This is kind of the same thing. It's making it a sin for you to not tell when you should. And in Leviticus chapter 5, there's a prescription of here's what you have to sacrifice in order to make that good. So this is something that's, to me, is a very wise idea. Because, like I said, one of the big difficulties is getting people to talk when, you know, when something bad has happened. And here the law builds into it an expectation that that's what is the norm, that that's what people should do. And historically, most democracies start off with people being more inclined to provide information, and as democracy begins to have breakdowns in certain places, it becomes harder and harder to find that. And unfortunately, one of the side effects of cities is that that is one of the areas where democracy starts to break down the most. And we're not going to go into that because that's a history thing and government thing and not a church thing, but still, it's true. So, okay, now, once you have done your thorough investigation, once the people presumably who know anything have stepped up and provided information, then the penalty is a clear penalty when it comes to sin. And so it continues in Leviticus chapter, sorry, actually this is going back to the Deuteronomy 17 chapter. He says, behold, this is after you've investigated thoroughly, behold, if it is true, and the thing is certain that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, then you shall bring out that man or that woman who has done this evil deed to your gates, that is, the man or the woman, and you shall stone them to death. So, when we talked about deterrence a few weeks ago, the idea that there are three elements of deterrence. It needs to be quick. I mean, it needs to the resolution needs to be quick. It needs to be appropriately severe, and it needs to be consistent. And you notice here that all of these things are being met. The idea that it's consistent because it's whoever it is, doesn't matter, you do this to them. It is quick because even though there's investigation, we're not dragging it out for months and months or years and years the way that so many of our cases are. And it is certainly a harsh remedy. And since God is the one who prescribed it, I'm going to say it's appropriate for what was done. Now, in our modern society, probably not so much, but it is done quickly. But notice again, on the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, he who is to die shall be put to death. He shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. The hand of the witness shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. So one of the things that's interesting here is if you're the one who accused the person, if you're the one who provided the evidence, what's your obligation?
To start
Are
throwing.
you the one that starts it out?
Yeah, you're the first thrower, basically, you know. So it puts a moral responsibility on you, which is presumably logical since you were the one who said that they committed this sin. That means, number one, you felt strongly enough about the fact that they committed this sin to tell people about it. And number 2, that you are in fact telling the truth because you're willing to actually kill a person, which would otherwise bring judgment on you even if no one would ever know about it, judgment on your soul anyway. But there's something else I think that's kind of interesting here, which is this idea that, you see it in 2 different places. First of all, it says, if it is true and the thing's certain. So there is this sense that everyone is confident that this is the right outcome. Which suggests to me that under some circumstances, if you get 2 or 3 of the wrong witnesses, maybe you might still not be prepared to go through with executing somebody. You can all imagine what 2 or 3 of the wrong witnesses might look like, can't you? You know, the sort of people that nobody trusts to do anything, the sort of people that are good for nothing, the sort of people that might take a bribe to say something that, you know, that they know isn't true. So there is a sense that the congregation, and by that term, when Moses used it, he's talking about all of the people of Israel. That the congregation has a job to discern truth from falsehood as best they can. Now, if you've got multiple witnesses, and at least some of those witnesses are trustworthy, then you can be confident in where you're going. But if you don't, then you better be careful, you know? And so the idea here is that that all of these things are meant to be safeguards to make sure that you get the correct result in the absence of the kinds of forensic evidence that we have, in the absence of the kind of more complex procedures that we have. And it's important to note that there is one really big distinction, other than the fact that sin is one of the bases for criminal offenses in the Mosaic system. The other really big difference is that in America, in the democratic system, we have what is the presumption if you are charged with a crime?
Innocent.
That you're innocent. You're presumed innocent until proven guilty. And our system is designed to defer to getting it wrong in favor of the defendant ahead of getting it wrong in favor of the state's case. Because we would, generally speaking, rather let someone who is guilty go unpunished than to punish and certainly to execute someone who is not guilty. Now, that is not something we see in the Mosaic Law. There is no inherent presumption of innocence. There is a presumption that if you follow the rules, justice will be done. And that's a different kind of a concept to a certain extent, which is not surprising because the authority of this system flows from a different place than our democratic institutions. Where does this authority flow from?
Well, initially from God.
From God, exactly. So we have God backing this one up. In our system, where does the authority flow from?
Legislature.
The people. Well, people feed it into the legislature, and then the legislature goes from there. But it's the people that it begins with. So we have a very different basis for our system, and it's reflected in how we are concerned about the justice of our system. Steve?
Yeah, I'm kind of glad we don't live under this system. Because let's say you have a friend or even a relative and you see that they're doing something, it's sinful not to bring it up, and then if you bring it up, you're the one that's got to throw the first stone. I mean, it's like, wow,
Yeah.
that's bad, but it's so the opposite. As Jesus speaks in Matthew 18, if your brother sins, go to him in quiet and see if you can turn him around.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't work, then bring some more folks. And if that doesn't work, talk about it before the whole church. And if that doesn't work, then treat him as a Gentile or a sinner. But you're not killing him.
Yeah.
You're just trying to you're trying to bring
Right.
it back into the fold.
Yeah. And you notice the difference, and that's really interesting because that last bit of it there is such a different, because notice, what's the motivation for all this in this passage? What does he say? What's the reason for all this?
To purge the evil.
Purge the evil from your midst. And you do that by eliminating whoever it is that's doing those evil things. But in the Christian system, purpose, as you just articulated, is to bring them back into the fold. Now, the outcome of both, is the result of both of them is to remove the evil from your midst. But one way is a retributive, I never can, it's retribution, and it gets them out, they're gone. The other one is restorative, and it brings them back in, and everything's okay. So there's a very different mindset going on here, but it's also tied in, I think, to the fact that we're talking about, well, first of all, we're talking about what I would say is sort of a much more child-like law. It's designed to deal with people who are not spiritually mature, versus the Christian law, which is designed to deal with people who are supposed to be mature. It also is the fact that one of these is the law of the land, where the other one is the law of a kingdom that is not a physical kingdom. And that's a pretty big difference. If Jesus had gone through and articulated all the things in the old law and said, and then you're going to take them out and stone them, the Romans would have had a problem with that. So even if we're talking about it from the standpoint of right and wrong, just from a practical standpoint, it doesn't really work to have the church carrying out some kind of corporal punishment. Now, there's been a few times in history where the church has been the government, but by and large, the church is designed to exist wherever it is. It doesn't need to have any control of the government. It doesn't need to have a friendly government. It doesn't need to have a government that supports it in any way. It is designed to operate without those restrictions. But more importantly, like I said, it is designed to operate like it's working with adults who can make adult decisions, as opposed to with children who need to be told exactly what to do and to have clear penalties for what they've done. But you're right. I mean, I would not like to live in this system. I wouldn't like to live there if I'd done something wrong. I wouldn't like to live there if I was a good person, because you'd be put in an awkward situation sometimes. The idea behind all this, though, is that if you do this a little bit, everybody shapes up and you don't have to worry about it. Which suggests, and in fact there's a lot of historical evidence to suggest that many of these laws and rules were followed very sporadically, if at all, throughout most of Israel's existence. Because had they been followed more strictly, it's likely that they would not have been falling away quite as often as they did. And so the failure to follow these rules ultimately led to severe consequences for Israel in terms of captivity and ultimately destruction. But the purpose of this was to try to keep them clean from all those worldly influences that were contrary to God's will. Okay, so he continues, God continues, he says, if any case is too difficult for you to decide between one kind of homicide or another, between one kind of lawsuit or another, between one kind of assault or another, being cases of dispute in your courts, then you shall arise and go up to the place where the Lord your God chooses. So you shall come to the Levitical priest or judge who is in office in those days, and you shall inquire of them, and they will declare to you the verdict in the case. So, this is, like I said, I'm really kind of amazed sometimes when I read some of these things, because this is basically saying if you have a hung jury, or if you just don't know for sure, you go to somebody who can get information from who? From God. So if you can't figure it out yourself, don't get it wrong. Take it to somebody who can actually ask God, and or who maybe through their own wisdom can figure it out because of their experience and the fact that God is more involved in their lives, or whatever it is. You take it to them. And so the Levitical priest, which would presumably be the high priest, or else at least the most close local Levitical priest, or the judge, which in that context is really referring to the idea of a spiritual leader. So someone like Deborah, who would judge between people because she was given wisdom from the Spirit to be able to do that. So you're going to take it to one of those guys, and they're going to declare a verdict in that case. Now notice some of the things they're talking about, deciding between one kind of homicide or another. That goes back to that question of, the axe head comes flying off and kills the guy. Was it murder? Was it an accident? Or somebody, he pushes the guy and the guy falls down and dies. Was it murder? Was it an accident? What kind of stuff? One kind of lawsuit or another, between one kind of assault or another. In other words, basically, these are relatively fine points of law for a relatively primitive society to even understand, much less to have put into law, which again speaks to the sophistication of the mind that actually created the law, as opposed to the people who it was given to. So he continues and he says, you shall do according to the terms of the verdict which they declare to you from that place which the Lord chooses. And you shall be careful to observe according to all that they teach you. According to the terms of the law which they teach you, according to the verdict which they tell you you shall do, you shall not turn aside from the word which they declare to you to the right or to the left. So there is this principle that you respect the law as it comes from God to the people that God appoints, whether it's high priests or judges, then down to people who are making decisions in the courts, and then down from there to the individual members of the society. That there is this idea that you follow the expectations and the rules, and you respect that authority, even if you don't like the outcome of the verdict. And that is something that, for the most part, is a central feature of most democratic institutions in most democratic countries. One of the reasons why the United States is successful is because it has had a long tradition, going back to England and other countries, a long tradition of democracy, of trusting the system, of people being willing to give up certain rights in order to have greater rights and greater opportunities, and respecting the processes of law. Whether it's the authority of police officers or the authority of the courts, these are things that are central to a functioning democracy. One of the reasons we have so much trouble exporting democracy to some of the places we've tried to do it, particularly in the Middle East, is because they don't have any of that foundation. It's not that the people of the Middle East don't want democracy. It's that they've never operated a democratic society at all. And you can't just go in and say, okay, here's how you're going to do it, when they don't understand it, when they don't have any basis in it, when they don't trust it. And so that's something, these are things that are endemic to our society, and in many ways they are drawn from the Bible. And they come out of the nations like Great Britain, and like France, and like Germany that had a Christian tradition. And this is a place where the Christian tradition, it's not that it comes across and says to us here in America, okay, you're going to do what the courts say because God set up the courts. Because God didn't set up the courts, the people set up the courts. What's happening is it's much more subtle than that. It's coming across in the undercurrent of what we understand and believe because of our background, because it's built into the court systems and the legal systems of many of the European nations, because they were Christian nations or nations that had Christian influences. In some cases, they were nations that were officially Christian nations. But in any event, those are built into their legal systems, and they come over here. And so we don't stop and think about a lot of times that, that this is influencing the way we think. But the truth is that the reason we trust our institutions and the reason we set them up the way we do is because of the traditions that look back towards these kinds of principles, even in the Old Testament. And so there are some really kind of interesting concepts in terms of how we understand our laws and where our laws come from that tie all the way back to the laws of Moses. Okay, so let's see where we are. All right, so let's look at this in practice. So Leviticus chapter 24, we have the story of an Israelite woman, the son of an Israelite woman and an Egyptian father. So the son of an Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian went out among the sons of Israel, and the Israelite woman's son and a man of Israel struggled with each other in the camp. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name and cursed. So they brought him to Moses, and they put him in custody so that the command of the Lord might be made clear to them. Okay, so you have somebody presumably when they left Egypt, either his father had died or, you know, who knows, maybe he just didn't want him, but the woman leaves with her son who is half Egyptian, basically. And so he gets into a fight with a guy who's pure Israelite, and then in the course of the fight, he curses and blasphemes the name of God. Now, what is the penalty for blaspheming the name of God? Death. So why do they have to stop and figure out, holy cow, why do they have to stop and figure, sorry, that was probably not entirely appropriate. I was a little surprised because there's quite a large number of people that were headed in here all at once. Okay, so, sorry, I get distracted easily sometimes. Bugs and squirrels and stuff like that. All right, so why do they have to stop and figure out what to do? Isn't the law clear?
To Israelites.
To Israelites it is. But this guy's not officially an Israelite. Why is he not officially an Israelite? Okay, and more important than that, actually under the law, what your status is flows through who your father is. Okay, that's actually significant in Ruth. We're going to talk about this more in a later sermon, but the reason that that's significant in Ruth is because it's why the sons why the sons of Boaz through Ruth can still be considered full Israelites, even though she's a Moabite, is because the heritage is measured through who your father is. So in this case, he is officially considered to be an Egyptian by the Israelites. And so the Israelites are not actually sure what to do because the law, as they understood it, applied to Israelites. If you're an Israelite, you don't blaspheme God's name. But he's not an Israelite, so let's make sure before we kill him. And here again, this is an important principle. And it's kind of amazing to me that the Israelites got this as quickly as they did, considering how primitive they were. You don't do something irreversible until you're sure you're right, okay? Because once the guy's dead, if it turns out you were wrong about how you applied the law, you can't fix that. If he's still alive, and it turns out you should have killed him, you can fix that real easy. So the thing is that you have to understand is, they're concerned and don't want to get it wrong. So they put him in custody, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, bring the one that is cursed outside the camp, and let all who heard him lay hands on his head, and then let all the congregation stone him. Remember, congregation is the entirety of Israel. You shall speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if anyone curses his God, then he will bear his sin. Moreover, the one who blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall surely stone him. The alien as well as the native, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death. So in this case, what would generally be considered more of a religious-focused law is extended to everybody. Now, by contrast, if you were this Egyptian guy and you didn't show up to sacrifice when you were supposed to, you wouldn't be held accountable for that because you're not an Israelite. If you didn't follow some of the other rules that were specifically directed at the Israelites alone, you wouldn't have to worry about that. Some of the other laws, though, laws about cleanliness, laws about maintaining the camp, things like that, they would be applied to everyone. And so there is a distinction that's drawn between how the laws apply to Israelites and how they apply to foreigners within them. But certain laws apply to everybody the same because in this case in particular, God has said you're going to get rid of the evil from among you, and certainly this kind of thing would be considered evil. But again, I want you to notice that the Israelites stopped and thought before they acted, and that's an important component of a functioning legal system. Okay, so now let's get into some stuff that really kind of directly parallels the language we have over in Exodus 20. Here God says, you shall not bear a false report. Do not join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after a multitude in order to pervert justice, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his dispute. Now this is kind of interesting because it's kind of saying, you got to watch out for being showing favoritism in two different directions. First of all, obviously, you'd think, don't become a malicious witness. What's a malicious witness?
False witness.
False witness.
Someone with a grudge against
Okay.
the accused.
Okay.
Get something out of it.
Or, yeah, somebody who's motivated by an unjust purpose, whether it's a grudge or whether it's some kind of bribe or whatever it would be. I can still remember one of the last cases that I tried in the Tucson office, the county attorney's office. In fact, it might have been the last felony case I tried before I went down and began to work in Ajo, was a case involving a breaking and entering, a burglary that had taken place in this neighborhood. And the house that these people lived in, both of them worked nights. And it was pretty well known in the neighborhood that they both worked nights. And so one particular night, somebody came along and they came up to their back patio, which had a sliding glass door. And this person, whoever they were, was able to put their hands against that door and through sheer strength and friction, lift the door off of its track and move it out of the way. Not a very well designed sliding glass door. In any event though, it takes a lot of strength to do something like that. But in any event, at the time that the case was investigated, there was a running joke in not just in my office, but in several other offices, that in the Tucson Police Department, that if you were good at your job, you got promoted to homicide or major crime or something like that. And if you're bad at your job, you got promoted to the property crimes unit because they wanted to get you away from the more serious crimes to minimize the damage that you would do to the public and the community relations because it's just stuff that got stolen. And this case reflected that because the officers made no serious attempt to investigate. They found a couple of different witnesses. One of them identified the guy that they thought was the suspect riding away from the house. Another one said he'd seen a guy riding away from, she said she'd seen a guy riding away from the house. And so they just went with that. They didn't even do fingerprinting, even though they had very, very clear fingerprints on the glass from the guy's hand that had lifted it up to move it. So they didn't even bother to fingerprint. So when I put the first witness on the stand and she began to testify, and this wasn't her house that got burglarized, we had no reason to believe she had any connection to the defendant in this case. The sheer hatred coming off of her towards the defendant was, everybody in the courtroom could see it. I mean, the jury could see it, the judge could see it, I could see it. The only person who didn't see it and notice it was the officer, who was the investigating officer. But, I mean, it was palpable how much she just hated this guy. And I have no idea why, but she just stared at him. You would have thought he had killed one of her family members. But as far as I could tell, like I said, there was no connection there. So when she got done testifying, I have to tell you I was deeply troubled about that case because this is really disturbing to see someone who has that level of animosity as a witness. I've seen witnesses who were upset about things, and I've certainly ones who had things done to them that were very upset, but I've never seen anybody like this before. So the next person I put on the stand, he testified that yes, he'd seen somebody riding away, but it didn't look like the defendant, and it had happened several hours earlier when he had seen him than when this woman claimed to have seen the defendant riding away. And ultimately what I reconstructed was that most likely what had happened was that someone early in the evening after the people left had gone and broken into the house and then stolen whatever was worth stealing, and then it became known throughout the neighborhood that the house was open, and people just kind of went throughout the night and basically took whatever they could. And there's a real possibility that the guy I had on trial was kind of one of the last ones to go in there and get something, but the simple fact was that there was almost the evidence just was really wonky about this whole thing. And I was fairly convinced the jury would not actually find him guilty, but more importantly, I was very concerned that the whole situation had been poisoned by this witness because of just how strong her animosity was. And so I actually dismissed the case myself on my own motion because I didn't think that we were going to get the right answer. I was afraid we might not get the right answer. When you have someone who is malicious for whatever reason, whether it's because of a grudge or because of a bribe or because of some kind of a principle thing where they disagree with that other person's position or whatever, you can get some very messed up situations going on in a courtroom, especially if you don't have a lot of witnesses. Or if in the case that we're talking about here, where you just need two or three. If you've got whoever's the guy with the money is and the guy he bribed, you got two people right there, So it can be very, very dangerous to not be able to discern when someone seems to have a motive, even if you don't know what the motive is. And so he says, so in Exodus, he says, you shall not bear a false report. In other words, you're not going to bring false testimony against someone. And then he goes on to say something else, which I think is very interesting. He says, you shall not follow the masses in doing evil. In other words, just because, my mom used to tell me this all the time, just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean you should do it. Now, if she probably should have gone to the scripture. That would have given a lot more authority, because sometimes our arguments, everybody else is jumping off a cliff, would you jump off a cliff? No, because I'm not an idiot, but I still want to have some Reeboks, there's a very big difference between those two things, But this, should not follow the masses in doing evil, okay? So this idea that just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean you should go with them. This is an important concept. He also says, you shall not testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after a multitude in order to pervert justice. Now, this starts to sound a lot like something that happened quite a bit during our civil rights era, or pre-civil rights era, which is what?
Well, there was just, the hatred against black was multiple.
What did it lead to?
It led to lynchings, it led
Mob
to
violence and
mob
lynchings.
violence.
Yeah.
It was, that exactly fits what occurred in this country.
And this is something that, this is not something that's unique to the American experience, and we should never, that's not an excuse, but we should not forget that reality. Throughout human history, there has been a tendency when something bad happens to find someone to blame and then try to bring some kind of justice or punishment to bear on them without ever really figuring out what really happened, or whether they really did it, or whether the penalty is appropriate. That is human nature. And you can see it even today if you pay attention, right now our political discourse is so irrational that it's really easy to see it. But you'll hear people talk about lynch so-and-so, hang them up. Really? Because they disagree with you politically? You think that's an appropriate response? You kick them out of the country. Well, they're citizens. You legally can't kick them out of the country, but even if you could, is that really the appropriate response to these things? We tend to be reactionary and overreactionary to things a lot of times. And one of the things that the law of Moses says to us is you don't make your decisions in the heat of the moment. You don't make your decisions without actually figuring out what really happened. You don't make your decisions just because everybody else is going that way. You take the time to stop and think and make the right decision. And when most people take the time to stop and think and make the right decision, the few lunatics on the fringes aren't able to run the show. But if the lunatics on the fringes get loud enough people start following them, eventually you reach a point where your society doesn't function rationally. And one of the scary things about where we're at in our society right now is that we're kind of getting close to a tipping point on this particular issue, where we no longer function rationally because we're so polarized that we have a very hard time making decisions rationally and looking at both sides and stopping and thinking rather than just doing and saying. And so that's a dangerous thing. And then finally he says, now this is really interesting, he says, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his dispute. So don't take money to lie, but also don't be partial to a poor man just because he's a poor man. And there is a tendency to do that as well, a tendency to say, well, something that, sure, okay, maybe this didn't really happen, but this guy's had a really bad life, and so let's just give him some money, The other guy's rich, he can afford it, whatever. Does that sound at all familiar? Mm-hmm. Right? We see that today in our society too. We see the idea that there was unjust things that happened to this group of people, or unjust things that that happened in this guy's life. He was raised in a terrible situation and all this different stuff. So you shouldn't punish him as severely, or you shouldn't hold him accountable for this, or you should make it up by giving them some kind of a favorable result. And the scriptures say, no, you treat everybody the same. You execute justice the same. Because that's what justice means, is that you do the same thing in any given situation. You don't change the rules for one person or another. Now, in fairness, in our society, these days, it is far more likely that if you've got money, you're going to be able to get the rules changed in your favor than if you're poor. But there is still a movement in both directions. There is a reality movement in the direction that if the more money you have, the easier it is to get away with stuff. And there is a societal movement in favor of basically saying, hey, if you've had a bad background, or if you have come from a heritage that's been oppressed, then we should, break the rules or change the rules for you. So it's going in both directions, with a lot of us that are kind of in the middle, who aren't real wealthy but don't have a disadvantaged background, going, wait a minute, I'm getting left behind in this, Everybody else is getting pushed ahead, and I feel like, and that then creates a sense of anger that leads to some of this kind of, multitudes going in the wrong direction. So we start to see that the more you get away from the principles of what we see here in the law of justice and fairness and those kinds of things, the more you do that, the more stresses there are on the functioning of your society, and the more things start to break down. And we can see that in operation in this country, we can see it in operation in other countries that got there faster than we did. Sarah?
So I'm reading a book called Coddling the American Mind. Real page turner. I don't do nonfiction very well, but it talks about this in a way that, Solomon says there's nothing new underneath the sun, and this is talking about emotional reactions. And sometimes, whenever it comes to logical things, you need to put those emotions in your pocket and use your brain, not your heart. And I see that today as well, that we have too much. There's nothing wrong with being passionate about something. There's nothing wrong with having emotions. But whenever that's the only thing that controls you, and then you try to use the legal system to back
Right.
your extreme emotions, that's where we're running into a problem. So I mean, yeah, you're hitting both ends of the spectrum. Don't do it to be mean. Don't do it because there's FOMO, and don't just take pity on somebody because you think that they're poor. Like, you have a time in your life where you must use logic that does not require emotion.
And historically, part of the idea behind having attorneys involved in the justice system was that they were supposed to be the ones who did not approach cases with emotion, with passion, that they were supposed to be dispassionate. Now, not to say that they weren't supposed to be, passionate about their client's cause, but they were supposed to evaluate their client's cause with an eye towards, reality. So your client comes to you and says, I want to sue this guy because he looked at me wrong. Your job as an attorney is to say, that's not a good case. You should not try to sue him. I'm not going to represent you if you try to do that. So the problem is, in part, is that what has happened is, over time, lawyers have become advocates, and they've lost sight of the idea of being dispassionate advocates. And they become advocates. You see movies like Aaron Brockovich, where you see TV shows like, there's a whole lot of different ones. LA Law, The Practice, The Firm. That's actually a different thing. Anyway, what you see there is attorneys who are willing to bend and even break the rules of the law in order to get their clients what they want. And people watch them and they think, I want a lawyer like that working for me. Well, maybe you do, but that kind of person messes up the legal system. And so, as that has become more common, now what we see is we have attorneys who no longer actually do their job of actually saying, okay, this is not a legitimate case. This is not a good thing to bring to the courts. And they go ahead and represent people, and they get up in public and say whatever they want to. I talked about this, I think, last week. They say whatever they want to until they get into court, and then they don't say it, but the public doesn't see what happens in the courtroom. They only hear what they say outside, and they think, if a lawyer's saying it, it's probably true, at least if it sounds like what I want to believe anyway. And so we create this situation where our courts appear to be in chaos, when in reality, they're not in as much of chaos as we think they are. Because what happens is that now we're seeing a disconnect, because if all I've been doing is listening to the guy who's telling me how strong a case he has, until he gets into court and actually represents what his real case is, but I don't see the court stuff, and then the court rules against him, what do I think has happened? If I believed the guy for what he said, what do I think has happened?
Injustice.
Injustice. Or worse yet, if the guy's really good at coming back out in an argument, it's going to be that I think the court is fraudulent, or that I think the court is biased and that justice is being perverted. And the truth is that I'm being lied to by one guy, but he has now created a level of doubt about the justice system that isn't realistic. Because the justice system, while it does have problems, it still functions better than the court of public opinion has ever functioned. And it yields more truth than our nightly newscasts and press conferences will ever yield. And so we need to understand the distinction between those two things. Jared.
I just got through reading the book too.
Wow, all of us.
Not quite as
Impressive.
fancy as Shara's. It was To Kill a Mockingbird.
Ah, yes.
Remember that story, that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it is that idea of a group of people, in this case, most of the community, assuming that somebody's guilty and making them guilty, not because that's what the facts are, but because that's what they had decided was true, regardless of what the law says. And so what I find, like I said, is so fascinating to me is that we have this in the scriptures, in the law of Moses, thousands of years before we ever tried to write our law here, or the Magna Carta was ever written, or any of those kinds of things. And there's this idea that if you stop and think rationally, and you make decisions when you're not in the heat of anger, when you're not, unable to think clearly, that you're going to make better decisions. And if you actually do a good investigation, and if you're not sure what to do, you go and inquire of someone who's wiser than you are. None of these are things that we do in our society anymore. Nobody ever stops to think, hey, I might not know everything. Hey, I might not be the smartest guy in the room. I might not have the wisdom to be able to decide what's true. Everybody thinks that they know everything and that they're always right, and so why should I listen to anybody else except somebody who says the same things I do, because I can be sure they're right because I'm right, right? But none of that is the system that God set up, and none of that was the system that our founding fathers set up either. And I'm not trying to say that our system is perfect, and that our founding fathers did everything right, and I'm not saying that this system would be an easy one to live under for the reasons that several people articulated today. But the principles that we see in this system came through to many of the principles that we see in our system, and what's scary is that today we are by and large ignoring some of those really important principles when it comes to how we treat each other, and when it comes to how we talk and think about political things and about legal things. And that should be scary, because generally speaking, history tells us when we start doing that, societies start to fall apart. And that's a disturbing truth. And unfortunately, that is the disturbing truth that I have to leave you on, because we're now over time for class. We'll pick up from there next week. Thank you guys for